This evening I've been thinking about Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego as we are moving into 2022. Our theme that Pastor Peter has brought to us last Sunday is a people with a purpose, people with a purpose, and knowing that God has a purpose for our lives. Wherever we are, whatever we do in life, there is a purpose that God wants us to fulfill. And knowing that God has a purpose for us should really fill us with confidence, because even in difficult times, God's purposes for us and through us will prevail as long as we are prepared to cooperate and partner with him. And so I like the story of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, because they were in a very secular, pagan environment. They weren't called to be prophets or priests or kings of Israel, but they found themselves as civil servants under a pagan regime in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. And so there they were, serving in a foreign land, serving a foreign king, but as you'll see, they refused to serve a foreign god because they recognized that God had purposes for them for being in this pagan empire, administrators right at the top. And they knew they had a purpose to serve there, but they also knew that purpose would never include worshipping a foreign god. So I'm just going to read the story to you found in Daniel chapter 3, because I think it's a little bit of a model for us to find out our purpose in life in a highly secularized, anti-religious or anti-Christian nation, but to know that wherever you are and whatever you're facing that is anti-God, anti-Christ, that God has put you there for a purpose, and his purpose will prevail as long as we don't compromise his purpose. All right, here we go. Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the government provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a fiery burning furnace." So at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O kings, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you've set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression of his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men, who were bound in their coats, trousers, and their turbans and other garments, and were cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these brave men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he said, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." Then Nebuchadnezzar went to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of the head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks against anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces. The houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. What an amazing story. And in this story, we see so many things that are pertinent for our lives as we seek to be salt and light in our city and our nation, and whatever area of career, society, or a neighborhood that we're involved in. God has a purpose for us. He had a purpose for these 3 men, didn't he? And before we go into what God did, just think about these men. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused point blank to worship any other god. But they had done pretty well so far in high office in the Emperor Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon's kingdom. Let me just find out where. Yeah, in verse 12 it says that they've been set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, these 3 men. So the first thing, before we go into them standing up and refusing to bow down to a golden image, they've got on pretty well with the ungodly and the unbelievers so far. In fact, they were in charge of the very province of Babylon, the very heart of the empire. And so these 3 men could speak the language of Babylon without imbibing the spirit of Babylon. They understood the laws of Babylon. They understood the ways of Babylon. They understood the language of Babylon. And they were very, very successful, and rose to power to be set over the affairs of the very province of Babylon. Imagine that. Jews from Israel put in charge of Babylonians in Babylon. We see this again, don't we, when we read another story about Daniel, and they were being told that they had to eat idolatrous food, non-kosher food, and they point blank refused to do it because it would have mean a denial of their religion. It would be a direct denial of Yahweh at that time to eat food of idols that wasn't kosher. And do you remember? So they just served them vegetables. And do you remember that they were, I mean, if any vegetarian wants to look at a scripture to try and persuade us to be vegetarians, they could go to that scripture where Daniel and his colleagues only ate vegetables and ended up fitter and healthier and shinier than all those that were eating meat. But I don't think they persuade many of us at Emmanuel. We like our meat too much. But they also, you see, they also understood the language of Babylon. Daniel was given a Babylonian name. And so what this says to us is that as Christians, we can fit in. We can exist in a environment that is ungodly, an environment that does not recognize God, that God can place us, and that we can learn the language of Babylon, operate within Babylon in that sense. But there comes a time when we have to recognize that we do not bow the knee to the golden image. Now, sometimes Christians are so offensive, so arrogant about their religion, that they're like a bull in a china shop. That the moment they're let out into some public arena or some workplace. And sometimes Christians make a fuss about things that aren't worth making a fuss for. And these guys, I'm sure there was many things they didn't agree with, many things they didn't like, many things that they thought this isn't the way we would do it. But they knew when to fight the battle, when to stand up for God, and when to fit in, even if they didn't agree things. And so it's important for us as Christians to recognize that the ungodly are ungodly, the secular are secular. Well, why are we surprised that they are like this? This is the way they are. And if God places us in a secular environment or employment, then as Christians, we are to show love. We are to show respect to those that believe other things that we certainly do not believe ourselves. But as we see in this story, there comes a time when our faith in God is directly challenged, and to do what's been asked to us to do, or to accept or subscribe to an opinion that we might be asked to subscribe to, would actually mean renouncing the tenets of our faith, our Christian faith, and our Christian morality. And when that time comes, we see the example of these men. They had built up a great reputation. They were faultless in every other way. They weren't bad employees. You know, sometimes you get Christians I've known in the past, and they're complaining about being persecuted. But I think to myself, actually, you're a very rough person with people, even in the church. You're very sort of like, you know, domineering. So I can imagine that you and the way you're talking about doing this, that, and the other, and you sort of think to yourself, maybe it's not Christian persecution. Maybe it's also a little bit of not being able to get on and be a decent work person. That can happen at times. But these were faultless in everything that they could be faultless for. And that's why they were where they were, and God had promoted them, and God was using them for such a time as this. But when the time came, and the line that they were asked to cross would be renouncing their faith in God, they didn't even need to think about it. They were just not going to do it, whatever the cost. And they were prepared to pay the cost and the price. And that's quite an important thing for us to reflect on, because, you know, they were great men and they had great power and they were providing for their family and they had great influence for the Jewish nation. They'd be able to share with people their Jewish faith and the God of Israel and protect their people who were in Babylon and watch over them. And now there was a situation where if they didn't bow their knee to a golden image, then not only would they lose their jobs, but their families might lose their lives too, and certainly would there be no livelihood, and their political influence would be zero, and who would protect all the Jews? And all of these things could come in to sort of bring a little bit of compromise. I mean, you know, maybe when they bowed their knee to the image, they could worship Yahweh or bind the demons, or they could think of some way maybe just to get out of it. But they didn't. The lines to them were clear, and they refused to do it. And of course, a despot like Nebuchadnezzar wasn't going to have that. And of course, we see here in these days that there was no separation between religion and government. State authority and religious authority were one. We call these things theocracies. And so, you know, to not accept or bow down to the to Nebuchadnezzar's religion was actually, in their view, it was treason. It was treason because the state and the religion were together. And this has often been a problem throughout the history, hasn't it? When the state and religion become one. So, you know, if you're not a Muslim in an Islamic state, then there's many things that you can't access or do because you're not a Muslim. And if you're persecuted because the state sponsors the religion, and the two are one. But here we see sort of like a foretaste or a foreshadowing of what Jesus would say when they tried to see if Jesus would in some way perhaps bow down to the image of Caesar. And they tried to catch him out. Remember, they gave him a coin, and on it was the inscription of Caesar Augustus, which basically said that Caesar was God. And it was like, what are you going to do with this coin? And taxes. And Jesus took the coin and said, give to Caesar's what's Caesar's and to God's what's God's. And so here in this passage, we see exactly that. We see that in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's mind, they had a very clear separation between the authority of the state and the authority of God. They had a separation. And so they would serve the state, even if they didn't like it. I'm sure they didn't like a lot of what was going on in Babylon. But, you know, I'm sure they weren't sitting there thinking, this is wonderful. I'm sure they wished for the days of Jerusalem. But they served in a state which must be very difficult for them. And they accepted the authority of the state, but not when it crossed over spiritual authority. They had a clear separation in their minds. And when it was obvious that they would have to renounce their God by these actions, then they said no. And the Nebuchadnezzar, the king, said, okay, you know, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? This is often the problem with the state, that the state can get so powerful that it tells Christians what they should believe and what they shouldn't believe, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, not the scriptures, but the state. And the state think they can do this because the state have power, they have laws, they have prisons, they have armies, they have police. And so the tendency of the state is not to appreciate properly spiritual authority or power and only understand political power backed up by force. And so they misjudge sometimes believers and Christians and the Christian faith and dismiss it and saying, look, we've got all the power, you just do what we say. And it looks from an earthly point of view that is the case, but it's not the case. And although Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understood the power of government, they were in government, they understood the power of eternal things and the power of God. And so they said, look, God can and will deliver us. So they have no fear of the government. They have no fear of the government. That's amazing, really. No fear of the government. In the end, they were part of the government. They had no fear of it because they understood the power of God. And so they realized that nothing can happen unless God ordains it or allows it to happen for his purposes. So they were safe in his hand. And they said, God can deliver us from you, and he will. But then there's this famous verse that you find in the New King James, this famous phrase where we go, and if not, he's able to deliver us from your hand, O king, but if not, we still won't worship your God. So there's this idea, as we believe we can be delivered, we're hoping to be delivered, but even if we're not delivered, we still trust God. And then, of course, you've got that beautiful picture, haven't you? There they are in the fire, and there's the fourth man. There's some great sermons on the fourth man. Oral Roberts, if you want to look, it's probably on YouTube, and you want to YouTube the fourth man, Oral Roberts. It's probably on there, one of the greatest sermons he ever preached on the fourth man, about the Son of God being right there with us in the furnace of affliction. And I won't do it now, but you can preach on this furnace of affliction and not being left alone, and Jesus being with you in it. But the fact of the matter is, they were delivered. And not only were they delivered, but the end of the matter was greater than the beginning of the matter. They weren't just restored to their positions, but everything was so much better, not just for them, but for God's people. He promoted them, it says. So they got promotion. And there was a decree that if anybody persecutes or speaks against the God of the Jews, then they would immediately be cut to pieces and their house destroyed, because there's no God that can deliver like this. So this is where sometimes the temptation would be, wouldn't it, to think that if I stand up for my Christian faith on essential things, the discussion of what is essential and what is not, well, that's where the discussion is, isn't it? I'm not here to enter into that, but not tonight anyway. But the fact of the matter is, this was so clearly a renouncement of God and serving something that they could have lost everything. But in fact, their standing up as Christians had a powerful impact on those around them. Although it looked like they were going to be destroyed, actually taking their stand ended up making a powerful impression on the top ruler. And he was impressed not just by them, but he was impressed by them, their faith in God and their God. And so at the end of it, then standing up and being prepared to lose everything for God, allowed God to exalt himself and to bring such a great deal of protection over the Jewish people that they would be able to worship in freedom and liberty under his rule, and nobody could attack them, and nobody could say to Nebuchadnezzar, they're not worshipping the state religion. So in the end, their taking a stand had a tremendous impact. Whereas if they hadn't taken a stand, if they had thought, well, we'll just keep it quiet and we'll say the Shema while we kneel before the golden thing. If they'd done it that way, they wouldn't have solved anything. They wouldn't have been promoted like that. God wouldn't have been exalted. In fact, he would have been, in many people's eyes, demoted because they didn't honor him enough. And so, as I end, I've been thinking about this passage, not because I think we're all going to immediately have to decide whether to bow down to a golden image or not, but just the sense that we are Christians and what we believe is important. And in the current raging discussions on gender, sexuality, what marriage is, and who can be married, and how many people can be married, and plurality, and all these types of things. We don't need to be rude. We don't need to be arrogant. We don't need to be crashing around. These guys didn't. They were good at their jobs and respected at their jobs by people from a very different faith from them. So they were honorable people. But at the same time, when it came down to it, they weren't forcing their faith on anybody else. They probably shared it, but they weren't forcing their views on anybody else. I'm sure they would influence where they could, but they didn't force it. But neither were they going to step down or step back from what they actually believed. And they were prepared to suffer loss to stand for what they actually believed. And of course, in history, some people did suffer loss. Not everybody got delivered from the fire, etc., but some did. And that's the fact is, the some that did and the some that didn't, guess what? God decides. God decides. Hebrews chapter 11 is amazing. At the end, it says, some were delivered from lions, some were brought back from the dead, some conquered armies, some administrated nations. And others were sawn in two. Others had to flee to caves. And all of it, they're all lumped together. And it was like, well, God can save or not save, but he is in total control, not the government, not Nebuchadnezzar. And if he saves in a situation or not, he is still the Lord. So be confident in your faith in 2022. Be confident if you're working in an environment or a place or your children go to a school that's not. Be confident, be who you are, be the best version of yourself, be a blessing to everybody around you, but also do not fear to stand or to give your opinion at the right time or to resist popular opinions, and do it quietly, kindly, and firmly. And these three men will encourage us when these moments might arise. Thank you, Pastor Doreen.